I found her profile by chance. She popped up on my feed one night, sandwiched between adverts and pointless updates from people I didn't care about. Her photo stood out, smiling by the sea, hair blowing across her face in a way that looked almost candid, like she hadn't spent 20 minutes perfecting the angle. She had this ease about her, like she belonged everywhere. I clicked on her account. Her life was all there, laid out like a map. The places she went, the things she loved, the people she surrounded herself with, it was all in her photos, captioned with little details she probably didn't think twice about. I didn't mean to fixate, I didn't mean to follow her so closely, but there was something about her that made it easy. She had this knack for pulling you into her world, making you feel like you were part of it. At first I kept my distance, liked her posts, left a comment here and there, nothing too much, just enough to make her notice me. And she did. She liked one of my comments once. I stared at that little notification for ages, longer than I'd like to admit. It felt like an opening, a connection, even if it was just a fleeting thing. She posted almost daily, sharing her coffee runs, her favorite corners of the city, the view from her flat, little breadcrumbs scattered for anyone to follow. I started recognizing landmarks in her photos, the park near the canal, the little bookshop with the faded sign. She didn't always tag locations, but I could piece it together. Her world felt small, contained, like it could fit in the palm of my hand. I sent her a message one day just to say hello, to let her know I appreciated her posts. She didn't respond. I told myself she was probably busy. People like her, they get swamped with messages. It didn't mean she hadn't seen it. Maybe she just didn't know what to say. So I sent another and another. Nothing big. Just short messages, a comment on her photos, a question about the places she went, little bits to remind her I was there. The silence didn't sit right with me. It wasn't fair. She put herself out there, sharing every little detail of her life for strangers to see, and yet she ignored the ones who cared. It felt wrong, like she didn't understand what she'd started. Then she blocked me. That's when I realized she didn't get it. She didn't see how much she mattered, how much she'd done by letting me into her life, even just a little. Blocking me didn't erase the connection. It didn't undo the hours I'd spent scrolling through her posts, mapping out her days. It didn't stop me from finding her in other ways. I knew the cafe she went to most mornings. The backdrop of her photos gave it away, the same little corner table by the window, the same chalkboard menu on the wall. I went there a few times, sitting where I could see the door. The first time I saw her walk in, it felt surreal, like stepping into one of her photos. She was smaller in person, more real, but just as perfect. She didn't notice me. She didn't see me the second time or the third. I wasn't doing anything wrong. I just wanted to see her, to understand her better. She had this way of moving, like she belonged to the spaces she occupied. I started to think of her as mine. She posted less after a while, no more morning coffees, no more sunsets from her balcony. It made me wonder if she knew, if she'd started to realize I was there just on the edge of her world. It wasn't enough to make me stop. If anything, it made me look harder, made me more careful. I started watching her flat from the street below, just to make sure she was safe. I'd wait until her lights came on in the evening, until they flickered out again late at night. One night I saw her leave. She didn't drive, she never did. Her posts mentioned how much she hated cars, how she preferred walking or taking the train. She didn't see me across the street, didn't notice as I followed her to the little market she liked. I didn't get too close, just enough to keep her in sight. She had this habit of pausing to take photos, angling her phone just so. It made it easy to keep up, easy to feel like I was part of her day. It wasn't stalking. Stalking was something people did to hurt others. I wasn't hurting her. I just needed to be near her, to see her in ways her photos didn't capture. The problem with her world was that it didn't leave room for me. She'd shut me out, but I couldn't let go. Not after all the time I'd spent. Not after everything I'd invested in her. She needed to understand that. She needed to see me the way I saw her. It was easy enough to get into her building. The security was laughable, just a code on a keypad that anyone could guess. I waited until the hallway was quiet, until the only sounds were the faint buzz of the lights and the hum of distant traffic. Her door was locked, of course, but locks are just puzzles with the right tools. Her flat was smaller than I had imagined, but it felt familiar. The plants on the windowsill, the books stacked on the coffee table, it was all there, just like her posts. I walked through her space, taking in the little details she never shared. The smell of her perfume, the way her clothes were folded in the wardrobe. It was intimate in a way her photos could never be. I set up the cameras where she wouldn't see them, one in the living room, tucked behind a stack of books, another in the bedroom nestled between the plants on the windowsill. They weren't big, just enough to let me see her when I couldn't be there, enough to keep me connected to her world. Leaving felt strange, like stepping out of a dream. I waited across the street that night, watching her lights come on, watching her move through the spaces I'd been. It felt right being so close, like I'd finally found my place in her life. She'll understand eventually. She'll see that I'm not going anywhere. I moved to Leeds in the spring. It wasn't a big decision, more of an escape. The city felt like a fresh start, with its rows of terraced houses, bustling high streets, and that faint smell of diesel and rain that clung to everything. I found a small flat on the edge of town, nothing special, just a single bedroom, an old boiler that groaned when the heating kicked in, and a window that overlooked a scrappy little garden. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That was the important thing. Work was fine too. I got a job at a cafe near the centre, one of those places that serves flat whites in mismatched mugs. The hours were long, but I didn't mind. It kept me busy, kept my head from drifting into darker places. The car showed up about a month in. It was a silver estate, nothing flashy, just the sort of car you see 100 of in a day. It caught my attention because it was parked across the street from the cafe every evening when I finished my shift. At first, I didn't think much of it. There was a takeaway on the same road, and I figured someone was waiting for their order. But then it started to feel consistent. Always the same car, always in the same spot. One evening, I decided to walk past it on my way home, just to see if there was anyone inside. As I approached, I saw the faint outline of someone in the driver's seat. I tried to get closer, but before I could, the engine roared to life and the car pulled away. That's when the knot in my stomach tightened. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a coincidence. It kept happening. Not every night, but enough to notice. Enough to make me glance out of the cafe's window more often than usual. The car would show up, sit there for an hour or so, and then disappear. I didn't tell anyone at work. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but I started walking home with my hood up, taking different routes, doubling back on myself to make sure no one was following. A week or two later, I saw the footprints. They were faint, just impressions in the soil beneath the window in my bedroom. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. They looked fresh, the edges still defined, leading to and from the fence at the back of the garden. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a fox or a stray cat. But cats don't wear shoes, and foxes don't press their faces to windows. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the glass sent my heart racing. By the morning, I decided to do something about it. I went to the nearest hardware store and bought a set of cameras. They weren't anything fancy, just a couple of small, battery-powered ones with motion sensors. I set them up around the house, one by the front door and one by the back garden. For a few nights, nothing happened. The cameras didn't pick up anything unusual, and I started to feel like maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe it was just paranoia. But then I checked the footage from the garden camera. There was a man. The camera had caught him in the early hours of the morning, standing by the window. He didn't do much, just stood there, hands in his pockets, staring into the flat. He was tall, wearing a hoodie with the hood pulled up, so I couldn't make out his face, but I didn't need to. I knew who it was. It was him. I sat there, staring at the grainy image on my phone screen, my chest tightening. I hadn't seen him in months, hadn't even heard from him since I left. But now he was here, outside my window, like he'd been waiting for me to let my guard down. I went to the police the next day. They took a statement and said they'd look into it, but I could tell they weren't convinced. Just a domestic matter, probably nothing serious. Their indifference made me feel smaller somehow, like I was overreacting. The next few days passed in a blur of anxiety. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't sleep at home. I started hearing noises, faint creaks and shuffles that seemed to come from inside the flat. I checked the locks every night, double and triple checking, but it didn't help. The cameras didn't catch anything new, but I could feel it. He was close. He was waiting for something. Then came the storm. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the rain lashed against the roof. I was sitting in bed, staring at the screen of my phone, refreshing the footage from the cameras every few minutes. Just as I was about to give up and try to sleep, the screen lit up with a notification. Motion detected. Garden camera. I clicked it immediately, the footage loading with a jittery lag. There he was, standing by the fence, illuminated by the camera's infrared light. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there, looking at the house. Then he reached up and grabbed the edge of the fence, pulling himself over in one smooth motion. He landed in the garden and walked towards the back door, his movements calm and deliberate. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I couldn't think, couldn't move. The feed cut out for a moment, and when it came back, the camera was tilted at an odd angle, the lens cracked. He'd taken it out. I scrambled to call the police, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. As I fumbled with it, I heard the sound of glass shattering downstairs. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the front door, running barefoot into the rain. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my breath coming in gasps, the cold biting at my skin. I flagged down a passing car, the driver's face a blur of concern as they rolled down the window. The police arrived half an hour later, but by then he was gone. The back door was smashed, the garden camera destroyed. They searched the house but didn't find anything. No fingerprints, no signs of him inside. Just the broken glass and the memory of his shadow on the camera feed. They said they'd patrol the area, keep an eye out, but I knew it wasn't over. He'd found me once. He could find me again. The key was already in my hand. It felt natural there, a small piece of authority that I'd earned by the contracts they signed and the rent they paid. A responsibility, yes, but also a privilege. That's what I told myself every time I turned the lock. I wasn't trespassing, I was ensuring everything was as it should be, ensuring their safety. That was part of the job, wasn't it? Her flat had been empty for a few hours when I arrived. I always waited for the right moment. I knew her schedule well enough by now. Mornings at work, evenings out running errands, the odd weekend afternoons spent with friends. She had a life that flowed in neat patterns, and I had a way of stepping between them, unnoticed. The flat greeted me with that quiet stillness that I'd come to expect, the air carrying the faint scent of lavender from the diffuser she kept near the sofa. It was a clean space, carefully arranged, though not overly neat. There were small signs of her routines everywhere, the way the cushions were plumped on one side of the sofa, the book left face down on the coffee table. She didn't realize how much she gave away about herself in these details, or maybe she did, but she didn't think anyone would ever notice. I walked through the flat methodically, checking the things I always checked. The pipes under the sink, the hinges on the cupboards, the draft from the windows. Of course, nothing was ever out of place, but that wasn't the point. These were excuses, the reasons I gave her when she asked why I needed to come by again. She never questioned it too much. Why would she? A landlord taking care of things is exactly what people want. I took my time in the kitchen, opening the fridge to see the contents lined up neatly inside. She had a preference for almond milk and those little pots of yogurt with granola. It made me smile knowing these small things about her life. From there, I moved to the bedroom. The wardrobe doors slid open smoothly, revealing the rows of clothes hung in order, separated by color. She had a good sense of style, I'd give her that. It suited her. Her jewelry box sat on the dresser, the lid left slightly open. I didn't touch it, there was no need. It was enough just to stand there, to see the things she surrounded herself with, the things she valued. The living room held the most of her personality, photos of friends and family on the shelves, a throw draped over the back of the sofa, a small stack of magazines on the coffee table. I always took extra care here. This was where she spent most of her time, and it showed. It felt like the heart of the flat, the place that was most hers. I noticed something different on the shelf near the TV. A small device, black and sleek, angled toward the room. I recognized it immediately. A camera. A tiny red light blinked on its side. She had set it up to watch the space, to watch me. It didn't alarm me. It was almost funny, in a way. She must have started to suspect, though I wasn't sure what she thought she'd find. I stepped out of its line of sight and considered my options. Leaving it there was a risk, but taking it would raise questions. She'd know someone had been here, that someone had touched her things. That wouldn't do. Instead, I moved it slightly, just enough to obscure the view. I doubted she would notice, and if she did, I could play it off as an accident. Perhaps I'd bump it with a tool during my next visit, make it seem like nothing at all. These little details were important. I finished my checks and locked the door behind me when I left. Her flat remained as it always did, untouched in any way that mattered. The camera had been a misstep on her part, a small hiccup in the routine we'd established. It wouldn't change anything. That night, I sat in my car across the street, the engine off, the windows slightly open. Her lights came on just after 7, a faint glow from the curtains that signaled her return. I imagined her walking through the flat, setting her bag on the counter, pouring herself a glass of wine. She wouldn't notice the camera until later, if she noticed it at all. Even then, there wouldn't be much to see, just the empty room, the quiet air, the life she thought was hers alone. I'd check on her again soon. I first saw him at a gallery opening. I wasn't there for him. I didn't even know who he was. But as soon as I saw his work, stark, raw, like he'd poured his soul onto the canvas, I knew I had to know more. The room was full of people flitting between the displays, all polite murmurs and half-empty wine glasses, but none of them seemed to really what he'd created, not the way I did. He stood near the back, awkward and unsure, half hidden behind a taller man who looked like he was explaining something. It took me a moment to realize he was the artist. His hands were shoved into his pockets, his hair sticking up as if he'd run his fingers through it too many times. He looked ordinary, but his art said otherwise. There was something in it, in him, that resonated with me. I waited until most of the crowd had moved on before I approached him. He seemed surprised, like he didn't expect anyone to come over. His reaction wasn't like the others I'd encountered. No forced smile, no condescension. He was real, awkwardly real, like his art. After that, I followed his career. I learned where he'd be showing his work, the kinds of galleries that took him on. His social media helped, though he didn't post much. I started going to his events, always staying at the edges, observing. He had a nervous energy that made it easy to predict where he'd move next. Sometimes I'd position myself in his line of sight, not close enough to stand out, just enough to make sure he saw me. I wanted him to remember me. Over time he did. I could see it in the way his eyes darted past me when he walked into a room. He'd glance over and then quickly look away, like he wasn't sure if he recognized me or not. I knew I was making an impression. It wasn't enough, though. He had to really see me. The way I saw him, I started leaving things for him. Small, thoughtful gifts at first. A note tucked into the corner of a frame at a gallery. A flower left near his easel during an open studio. Nothing too much. Just enough to show I understood him. I even created a piece inspired by one of his works, though I didn't sign it. It was my way of speaking to him, of showing him that I could create too, that I was worthy of his attention. It wasn't until I left the painting outside his flat that I realized how deeply connected we were. I'd spent weeks on it, studying the colors he used, the way his lines seemed both precise and chaotic. When I imagined him finding it, picking it up, I felt something shift inside me. But then he changed. He started skipping events, posting less. He seemed distant. I began to worry he was pulling away, that he didn't understand what I was offering him. I tried to think of ways to reach him, ways to make him see that I wasn't like the others, that I understood him. I started spending more time near his flat, watching for the little routines that made up his life. He liked to leave his curtains open, just enough to let the light spill out. From the alley across the street, I could see him painting late into the night. Sometimes he'd pace back and forth, running his hands through his hair like he was fighting with himself. It was beautiful to watch, but it wasn't enough. I needed to be closer. I found a way in one night, through a window he'd left cracked open. His flat smelled like turpentine and coffee, like creation and exhaustion. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in. His easel was in the corner, a canvas half finished and smeared with reds and greys. There was a plate with crumbs on the coffee table, a stack of sketchbooks on the sofa. It was exactly how I'd imagined it, chaotic but perfect. I didn't touch anything. I wasn't there to disturb him. I just wanted to feel his world around me, to understand what inspired him. Before I left, I placed another painting on his kitchen counter, propped up against the fruit bowl. It was my best work yet, a portrait of him from memory. I wanted him to know that I saw him, truly saw him. The night I stood over him, I didn't mean to wake him. I just wanted to see him up close, to understand the way his features softened in sleep. His breath was steady, his hands relaxed on the pillow. He looked vulnerable, fragile in a way that made my chest ache. But then his eyes opened. For a moment, we just looked at each other, the way I'd always wanted. He was confused at first, then afraid. I tried to show him the painting, to make him understand why I was there, but his reaction was all wrong. He didn't see the connection, the beauty of it. He didn't see me the way I saw him. Now, I don't know what will happen next. I've left the painting, left the flat, but I can't let it end like this. He has to see me. He has to understand. I moved in on a Monday. It wasn't a decision made lightly. I'd been watching the house for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Houses like that, rented by students, were perfect, always chaotic, doors left unlocked, windows forgotten, routines predictable. 3 of them lived there. I could tell from the lights at night, the sounds of voices carrying through the thin walls and the occasional arguments that echoed out to the street. They seemed careless, which suited me fine. The attic was cramped, dusty and dark, but it wasn't terrible. I'd stayed in worse places, a few rat droppings here and there, some cobwebs. Nothing unbearable. The important part was the crawl space, the section of the attic that ran over the entire length of the house. From there, I could get anywhere without being seen. The small, retractable ladder in the hallway below led straight up to my hiding spot. They didn't seem to notice the faint scrape it made when I used it, or the tiny shift in the trapdoor's position when I slid it back into place. For the first few days I didn't come down at all. I waited, listening to them go about their lives. Their schedules became clear quickly enough. The guy with the loud laugh and the scruffy hair, he was always out early, usually with a gym bag slung over his shoulder. The blonde girl spent more time in her room than anywhere else, her door shut tight. The quiet one with glasses, she stayed up late, tapping away on her laptop or reading in the living room. I moved quietly, taking care not to leave any signs. At night, I'd slip into the kitchen and take just enough to eat without anyone noticing. An apple here, a slice of bread there. They weren't careful with their food. Half-eaten boxes of cereal sat open on the counter and takeaway containers piled up in the bin. It wasn't hard to blend in with the mess. The trouble started when I took a t-shirt from the laundry basket. I didn't mean to, not really. I just liked the smell of it. Fresh detergent, clean fabric. It was comforting. I told myself I'd put it back the next night, but by then they'd noticed. The blonde one was the first to say something. Her voice carried through the thin ceiling as she complained about someone messing with her stuff. The guy laughed it off, blaming one of them, and that was that. For now. I should have stopped there, but I didn't. A part of me wanted to test how far I could go. I started taking little things, a bar of soap from the bathroom, a hairbrush, a pair of socks, small enough to be overlooked, or so I thought. The blonde one got angrier, accusing the others of being careless or spiteful. Their arguments grew louder, more frequent. It amused me at first, listening to them snap at each other over things I'd taken. The problem was the quiet one. She didn't argue as much as the others, but she noticed things. I could feel it. Her gaze lingered on the attic hatch one evening, her expression thoughtful. She moved through the house differently, quieter, like she was listening for something. I started hearing her footsteps late at night, pacing beneath me. I began to feel trapped, cornered in my own hiding place. The house felt smaller somehow, their presence pressing against me. I tried to stay calm, to move less, to take even smaller things, but the tension in the house grew sharper by the day. The blonde girl stormed off one night, slamming the door behind her. The guy muttered something under his breath and retreated to his room. The quiet one stayed up late again, pacing and staring at her laptop. I should have left then. I should have packed up what little I had and found another place, but the attic was warm, the house familiar, and I didn't want to leave. That was my mistake. One night when the house was silent and the lights were out, I climbed down to the kitchen for water. I'd been careful, moving only when I was sure they were asleep. But as I reached for a glass from the counter, I felt a shift in the air. A faint pressure, the sense of being seen. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. She was standing in the doorway, the quiet one, her face pale and rigid. Her eyes locked on me wide with disbelief. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she turned and bolted for the stairs, her footsteps loud against the creaking wood. Panic surged through me. I couldn't let her wake the others. I moved quickly, chasing her up the stairs, my bare feet thudding against the steps. She reached her room and slammed the door, but I was there before she could lock it. The force of my shoulder sent it crashing open, splinters of wood flying. Inside, she stumbled backwards, her hands grasping for something. Her phone, a lamp, anything to defend herself. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, and raised my hand. The door to the guy's room opened behind me, and I turned just in time to see him rushing towards me. His fist connected with the side of my head, and I stumbled, the room spinning. The blonde one screamed from somewhere down the hall. I ran, shoving past him and down the stairs, my vision blurred and my ears ringing. The front door was locked, and I fumbled with the latch, my hands slick with sweat. Behind me, their voices grew louder, their footsteps closing in. I wrenched the door open and fled into the night, the cold air biting at my skin. The house disappeared behind me as I ran, its lights blazing in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of town, my chest heaving and my mind racing. I don't know if they saw my face. I don't know if they called the police. But I know this, the attic is empty now, and I'm already looking for another house. When I found him online, it felt like fate. I don't use that word lightly, but it's how it felt. He wasn't like the others. His profile wasn't loud or showy, not full of tired jokes or obnoxious photos. It was unassuming, simple. It drew me in because I could tell he wasn't trying to be noticed. Those are the ones you notice most, the ones who aren't performing for attention. Our first meeting went better than I'd hoped. He smiled a lot, and it wasn't forced. He made eye contact, but not too much. He asked me questions, little things about my day, my job, my family. By the time we parted ways, I felt like I knew him, like I'd known him forever. He didn't know it, but we were already connected. We went out a few more times. He was polite, considerate, everything I'd hoped he would be. But then, without warning, he pulled away. The messages came less often, the plans got vaguer, until finally he ended things altogether. It wasn't cold or cruel, he just said it wasn't working out, that he thought we were looking for different things. I wasn't angry, not really, disappointed maybe, but I didn't blame him. People make mistakes, and I understood he'd need time to realize his. So I waited. I sent him messages now and then just to remind him I was still there. Nothing too much, just enough to keep the connection alive. He stopped replying eventually. I suppose I can't blame him for that either. Sometimes people don't know what they need until it's right in front of them, so I decided to make it easier for him. To be there when he finally realized he didn't want me gone after all. I remember the first time I let myself into his house. It wasn't difficult. He always left the back door unlocked as if he trusted the world to leave him be. It was strange stepping into his space without him there. It was quieter than I expected, but in a way that felt calming. Everything about the place was practical, no frills or clutter. It suited him. I didn't take anything. I didn't touch much either, just walked around, absorbing it. The books on his shelves, the photos on the walls, it all told a story, one I felt like I was already part of. The crawl space wasn't planned. I found it while exploring a small hatch in the hall closet. I don't know what made me open it, but when I saw the narrow space inside, the idea came to me all at once. I could be close to him without being in the way. I could watch over him, help him, and he wouldn't even have to know. Setting up the cameras was tricky. I had to make sure they were hidden, that he wouldn't notice them in his day-to-day life. One in the living room, tucked into the corner of a bookshelf. Another in the kitchen, behind a small decorative clock. The last one in his bedroom, carefully positioned to blend in with a stack of unused electronics on top of his wardrobe. Once it was done, I felt a sense of peace. I hadn't known in weeks. I could see him now, his routines, his habits, the way he stirred his tea counterclockwise, the way he stretched his neck after sitting too long at his desk. It was comforting, knowing he was safe, knowing I could be there for him without disrupting his life. The crawl space wasn't comfortable, but it didn't matter. I only stayed there occasionally when I felt like I needed to be closer to him. Most of the time I watched from afar, content with the glimpses the cameras gave me, but then things changed. He started locking his doors, pulling his curtains closed at odd times of the day. He spent more time out of the house as if he were avoiding being there. I wondered if he'd met someone new, if there was someone else taking up the space I'd left behind. The thought gnawed at me, but I reminded myself that connections like ours don't just disappear. One night, while he was out, I slipped back inside to check the cameras. One of them, the one in his bedroom, had stopped working. I couldn't let it stay like that. What if something happened, and I couldn't see it? The bedroom felt colder than before. I worked quickly, adjusting the camera and making sure it was back online. As I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped me. On his nightstand, there was a small framed photo of him and a woman I didn't recognize. She was smiling, her arm around him like she belonged there. I stayed in the crawl space that night, unable to bring myself to leave. I needed to understand what was happening, to figure out what this new presence in his life meant for us. The next morning, I heard him moving around the house, the sound of his footsteps passing by the closet door. He paused for a moment, right outside where I was hiding. I held my breath, waiting for him to move on. He did, eventually, but it was enough to remind me how fragile the balance was. I'm still here, waiting for him to see that I never left. The cameras are still running. The The crawl space still my refuge. He'll realize it soon enough. He has to. People like him don't just forget connections like ours. They can't. The first complaint came after a quiet Sunday evening, one of those uneventful nights when the biggest worry should have been making sure the school uniforms were clean. My daughter mentioned seeing someone outside her bedroom window. She didn't seem scared, just matter-of-fact about it, as if it were no different than spotting a fox slinking along the garden wall. I reassured her with the usual parent's dismissiveness, thinking she'd probably mistaken a branch swaying or maybe even her own reflection in the glass. It wasn't something I gave a second thought to. Kids see things all the time, especially at night when their minds wander. But the next morning, when I stepped into the garden to fetch the recycling bins, I noticed a single footprint in the damp soil under her window. It was smeared and faint, half erased by the soft drizzle overnight. It could have been mine, I thought, though I didn't recall being there recently. I looked up at the window but shrugged it off, reminding myself how easy it is to overthink things when you've got a child with an active imagination. The following week passed without incident. If there was anything out of the ordinary, it didn't reach me. Then one night she woke me up and told me the man was back. This time she sounded more anxious, her voice trembled and her eyes darted around the room as though expecting him to appear any moment. I walked her back to her room and did a cursory check of the garden through the window. It was dark out there, the faint glow of the streetlights too far away to offer any real illumination. I couldn't see anything. Still, to put her mind at ease, I went outside with a torch. The grass was slick and muddy, and the beam of light caught nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. The fence around the garden was high, and the latch on the gate was still secured. By the time I came back inside, she was already half asleep, clutching her blanket like a lifeline. I went back to my room, reminding myself it was probably nothing. Over the next few days, her complaints grew more frequent. She'd whisper about the man standing under the tree near her window or mention hearing soft thuds against the glass. I began to pay more attention. I started keeping the curtains drawn in her room and made sure the windows were locked tight before bedtime. I even installed a motion sensor light outside, its beam harsh and bright enough to cut through the dark corners of the garden. The light never went off, not even once, yet her stories didn't stop. One evening, while tidying up, I noticed something peculiar. The lock on her window had been turned ever so slightly. It was subtle, not enough for the latch to disengage entirely, but just enough to make me stop and wonder. My hands froze as I inspected it. I thought back to the motion light and how it hadn't picked up any movement. Perhaps I hadn't installed it at the right angle, or perhaps it was something else entirely. I tightened the lock, checking twice before stepping back. That night I barely slept. Every noise, every creak of the house settling set my nerves on edge. I kept checking the garden from my own window, half expecting to see someone standing there. But it was always empty. A few days later, after the rain had softened the ground again, I found more footprints under her window. This time, there were several. They were faint, as though someone had moved cautiously, avoiding leaving too deep an impression. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone had been there. My stomach churned as I stared at them, the damp air suddenly feeling colder than it had any right to be. I searched the garden, checking every corner and under every bush, but whoever had been there was long gone. That night, I placed a chair against her window, wedged tightly under the latch. It wasn't much, but it was something. I stayed up listening to every sound, the silence between them more oppressive than any noise could have been. The storm came a week later. The wind howled and rain lashed against the house in sheets. It was the kind of weather that made the whole world feel distant, like everything beyond the walls of your home had been erased. I was in the living room, half distracted by the noise, when a sound cut through it. A sharp clatter, like something hard against glass. I froze, my heart pounding. It had come from her room. I bolted upstairs, my feet barely touching the steps, and found her sitting upright in bed, her face pale and wide-eyed. She pointed towards the window where the curtains shifted slightly in the wind. The latch was undone. The chair I had wedged against it had been pushed aside, toppled onto its side. Rain poured through the small gap, soaking the windowsill and dripping onto the floor. I rushed to the window and slammed it shut, locking it again. My hands were trembling as I scanned the garden, but it was impossible to see anything through the downpour. I turned back to her, my mind racing. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. She stayed in my room, curled up under the covers while I sat by the window staring into the rain-soaked garden. By morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a grey, miserable day. I stepped outside, dreading what I might find. The footprints were there, deep and fresh, leading from the tree to the window. They circled the garden, pausing by the back door before vanishing beyond the gate. The lock on the gate hung loose, the latch twisted as though it had been forced open. That night, I bolted every door and window, checked and rechecked every lock, but the house felt different, like it wasn't entirely mine anymore. As I stood in the living room, staring out into the darkened garden, I caught a glimpse of something in the glass, a reflection, faint and fleeting. By the time I turned around, there was nothing there. I remember when she moved in. The van pulled up on a sunny Tuesday, and two men carried boxes into the little semi-detached house next door. She followed them up the drive, holding a potted plant in both hands. I remember thinking how she fit the place, like she belonged there. Her hair was tied back and her clothes were casual, comfortable. She didn't know I was watching from my window, and that made it feel like I was already part of her life. I introduced myself a few days later. She was in her front garden, fiddling with a tangle of ivy on the fence. I offered to help her trim it back, and she smiled. It was the kind of smile that makes you feel like you've done something right, like you've made a connection. From then on, I made myself useful. I fixed the loose latch on her garden gate. I helped carry her groceries in when she came back from the shops. She thanked me, and sometimes she'd offer me a cup of tea. I always made sure to decline politely. It wasn't about the tea. It was about being there, about being part of her world. But then she changed. It was subtle at first. She started leaving earlier in the mornings, coming back later in the evenings. The small chats we used to have on the pavement turned into brief nods or waves. When I knocked to let her know the postman had delivered a package to my house by mistake, she took it without opening the door fully. I didn't understand it. I'd done nothing but help her. I thought about it for days, replaying every interaction in my mind, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. The answers didn't come, but the need to fix things grew stronger. The turning point was when she asked me not to come over uninvited. Her words were calm, but her meaning was sharp. She was shutting me out. The warmth in her voice was gone, replaced by something cold and distant. It hurt. I told myself she was just stressed, that I could win her back by being patient, but she didn't change her mind. She stopped replying to the notes I left in her letterbox. She pulled her curtains closed at night, even though she never used to. I could feel her shutting the door on me, locking it, bolting it. It wasn't fair. When she stopped speaking to me altogether, I knew I had to act. I waited until she was out, her car gone from the drive, her house quiet. I used the back gate and found the spare key she'd once told me about, tucked under a loose brick near the shed. It was almost like she'd wanted me to find it, to remind her that I was still there for her. The inside of her house felt different than I expected. It was quieter, smaller, like stepping into a part of her she didn't share with anyone else. I moved carefully, making sure to leave everything exactly as I found it. I didn't want her to know I'd been there. I didn't want her to feel unsafe. I set up the cameras in places she wouldn't notice. One behind the books on the shelf in her living room, angled towards the sofa. Another above the kitchen cabinets, hidden among the dusty jars she never used. The last one in her bedroom, tucked into the corner where the curtain always hung slightly open. I didn't do it to hurt her. I did it because I missed her. I missed the way her voice sounded when she talked about her garden, or how her hair fell over her shoulder when she looked down. The cameras let me be part of her life again, even if she didn't know it. For a while, it worked. I'd watch her in the evening, sitting on the sofa with a book or making tea in the kitchen. She'd hum to herself sometimes, and it felt like she was doing it just for me. I kept track of her routines, noting the times she left for work, the nights she stayed out late, but then she changed again. She started looking over her shoulder more often, glancing at the windows as if she felt something. She spent less time in the living room and more time locked in her bedroom. I knew she was feeling the same connection I did, but she didn't understand it, not yet. The last time I went into her house, it was because I needed to adjust one of the cameras. The angle had shifted, and I couldn't see her bed clearly anymore. She was out again, her car gone, the curtains in the living room drawn. I let myself in quietly, the key fitting perfectly in the lock. I was careful, as always. I moved through the house like a shadow, my footsteps light against the floorboards. I fixed the camera and took a moment to look around her room. Her scent was everywhere, warm and familiar. I stood there for a while, feeling close to her in a way I hadn't for weeks. I heard the car pulling into the drive too late. Panic gripped me as I realized I hadn't locked the back door behind me. I scrambled to leave, slipping out just as her front door opened. I ran through the back garden, the key still in my pocket. I don't think she saw me, but I can't be sure. Now I watch the cameras more often, waiting for her to mention it to someone, to call the police or change the locks, but she hasn't. She moves through her days like nothing's happened. But there's something in the way she checks the doors before bed, the way she turns her head towards the corners of the room. When she thinks she's alone, she knows I'm there. She just doesn't know how close.